Today, I would like to share some of the glorious music and stories from Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens, the most splendid and significant of all the Georgian gardens, which inspired other pleasure gardens across the world. I'm not an art historian or a very good gardener, but I'm looking purely at the music. I want to start off showing a clip from a concert at Handel's church, St. George's, Hanover Square, from the London Handel Festival, to set the scene of today's talk about music from the summer evenings at Vauxhall in the mid-18th century.
Hello, my name is Bridget Cunningham. I'm the Artistic Director and Conductor of London Early Opera, a UK registered charity who specialise in Baroque performance and research and work with leading musicians, historians and musicologists.
Our party comprising myself, Mrs. T and our two daughters, arriving at Vauxhall.
I conduct all kinds of music, from Monteverdi, Beethoven to new BBC commissions, and I'm very passionate about directing from the harpsichord, both Baroque opera and concerts, just as Handel did.
By the summer seasons of the mid-18th century, Vauxhall Gardens, or Spring Gardens, as it was often referred to, was a place where all the family could go to in the evenings to listen to glorious and patriotic music near the bandstands, eat food and promenade in the illuminated gardens, walkways, groves and grottos, admiring the fountains, statues and entertainments. It was a place which showcased delightful performances and the exuberant promotion of the music of George Frederick Handel and his English contemporaries, performed by the leading stars of the day. Here is Handel's Hornpipe, composed for Vauxhall in 1740 with Daniel Malt on the organ. Today, I'm sure many of you know, there is not much left of Vauxhall Gardens. But if you walk around the vibrant and trendy Vauxhall with its menacing MI6 or MI5 building, you can still see a small part of the Spring Gardens remaining near the river. And some of the roads are named after 18th century composers who originally worked there, such as Stanley Street, Morgan Street, Arne House, as well as the streets named after the visionary Jonathan Tyers, who was proprietor of the gardens. The altar at St. Peter's Church on Kennington Lane, if you know it, was built on the site of the original fireworks tower. So Vauxhall Gardens is still a fascinating place to rediscover. I would encourage you to go for a guided walk with David E. Cook, the co-author with Alan Borg of the most fabulous book, Vauxhall Gardens, A History, published by Yale. I was lucky to work with him and record 2 albums of music called Handel at Vauxhall with London Early Opera and Signum Records. Here is a clip from Handel's Mask Comus with the aria There in Blissful Shades and Bowers, sung by Benjamin Bevan. Going back to the late 17th century, before Handel, the diarists John Evelyn and Samuel Pepys were visitors at Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens and enumerated some of the delights of a visit, in particular the boat trip across the Thames, the song of the resident nightingales, and also the seductive women who made Vauxhall one of their favoured places to work. By the mid-18th century, Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens had transformed to become a civilized Georgian garden due to the successful relaunch by a new proprietor called Jonathan Tyers, who was the owner from 1729 until his death in 1767, and was the greatest 18th century patron of the arts, who most people have never heard of. In 1732, Vauxhall Gardens was launched with a ridotto al fresco. This exotic event, largely organized by the impresario John James Hildegard, was attended by the young and popular Frederick, Prince Frederick, Prince of Wales, and hundreds of the wealthiest and most fashionable Londoners, and also the composer George Frederick Handel attended. More of a ridotto al fiasco, this event lost Tyers a lot of money. As a tradesman from Bermondsey, Tyers knew that he did not have the skills or the contacts to introduce music and art of the highest quality into his gardens. But he did, however, have the invaluable skill of delegating to the right people. His neighbour, the artist William Hogarth, had a revolutionary plan to change his fortunes, to turn Vauxhall into the first outdoor public art gallery, al fresco. Hogarth encouraged Francis Hayman and other young artists to join him and paint and display their works in the supper boxes, which were little shelters where people dined. These paintings were used as conversation pieces with pastoral, military, naval, or Shakespearean themes. They were protected by a panel which dropped down to reveal them. William Hogarth also designed some season tickets, which were engraved on silver tokens and included an image of Apollo with his lyre. Spectators could buy a beautifully engraved season ticket or pay the admission charge of 1 shilling, the equivalent of about £15 today. This charge remained unchanged for almost 60 years, and Hogarth himself was given a medal and a lifetime subscription to Vauxhall. I have an anecdote I will read about Handel and Hogarth. I'll just find it. Hogarth admired Handel greatly, much more so than the English composer Maurice Greene. Hogarth was told that a surgeon of St. Bartholomew's Hospital, a Dr. Freak, had asserted that Greene was as eminent in composition as Handel. Hogarth defended Handel and said, "That fellow Freak is always shooting his bolt absurdly, one way or another. Handel is a giant in music. Greene, only a light florimel." "Aye," said the informant, "but at the same time, Mr. Freak declared you were as good a portrait painter as Van Dyck." Hogarth then added, "There he was right, and my God I am. Give me my time and let me choose my subject."
Flora, goddess sweetly blooming, ever airy, ever gay, all her wonted charms resuming, to spring gardens calls away. With this blissful sport delighted, here the Queen of May retreats. Bells and bows are all invited to partake of fairy sweets. To partake of fairy sweets.
It was probably Heidegger who introduced Handel to Jonathan Tyers and also persuaded Tyers to place high quality music at the very center of his project, making music the chief entertainment at the gardens. As Handel advised on music, Hogarth advised on artwork, and together with Jonathan Tyers, produced at Vauxhall a truly dynamic focal point for the best contemporary British art and music in England's capital city, a spot where British art and music could freely develop in the circle of Tyers' enlightened patronage. Jonathan Tyers cleverly looked for new ways to bring Vauxhall Gardens to the attention of the press and converted his own ballroom into a pavilion with a private dining room for Prince Frederick, Prince of Wales, who was also the landlord of Vauxhall Gardens and became a regular attendee at these Vauxhall concerts, bringing with him a large following of fashionable society. Tyers commissioned a new octagonal bandstand or orchestra, which was possibly the first building in London designed solely for the performance of music. It provided a raised stage for the permanent band of musicians so they could be seen and heard by everybody in the Grove. And it also separated the band from easy contact with the audience so that requests for popular pieces of music, which had been the previous method of programming, became a thing of the past. This allowed for the introduction of newly written works by contemporary composers within a pre-organized program. In 1737, a new organ, possibly built by Richard Bridge with the assistance from John Byfield the Elder, had been installed at Vauxhall and later on had new mechanisms added to it, including a much admired symphony of singing birds and a carillon, which were possibly heard for the very first time in a widely reported occasion in which the Prince of Wales visited the gardens and Hushy Pretty was played on the carillon, accompanied by the artificial bird. building itself was a square structure adjoining the orchestra building, which together formed the most innovative and revolutionary installation by Tyers at Vauxhall. It contained 3 levels with the organ pipes and possibly the main organ console on the first floor, while the belfry contained 4 louvered semicircular openings, projecting the organ sound to the far distances of the gardens. It was therefore economically a sound investment, as it did the job of several musicians. Tyers also commissioned the sculptor Louis-Francois Roubiliac to make a full-length, life-size portrait sculpture of Handel, made out of noble white Carrara marble. In 1738, this was placed on a tall plinth in a prominent site in Vauxhall's central grove. All serious artists and musicians now wanted to work for Tyers at Vauxhall because they now knew that their profession would be taken seriously by this new style of patron. Roubiliac's statue of the sculpture is now displayed at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, but it remained at Vauxhall until the 1820s. Here it is with a picture of it with music by John Hebden, who was a composer, bassoonist, cellist, and bass player at Vauxhall. The presence at Vauxhall of this remarkable sculpture kept Handel securely in the public eye at a time when his popularity was not guaranteed. It rebranded him as an approachable everyman rather than the distant figure, the almost mythical creator of convoluted, incomprehensible Italianate opera. While Tyers never appointed Handel as his musical director at Vauxhall, Handel had an immense influence on the music performed, and this unique opportunity encouraged Handel to broaden his own appeal, seizing the ideal opportunity to try out new compositions of secular music on a new and fashionable audience. There has for many years been a tendency among musicologists, musicians, and historians to overlook the music of the London pleasure gardens. While this could be justified in respect of the vast majority of such places scattered around London's suburbs, the leading pleasure gardens, Vauxhall, Ranelagh, and Marylebone, should perhaps not be tarred with the same brush. In fact, the music of these gardens, whether a new oratorio or a popular romantic ballad, became the dynamic soundtrack to the greatest entertainments of Georgian England, heard and enjoyed by 100,000 visitors every season. The first mass audience ever gained by serious music. It's like Glastonbury. As all of Vauxhall's composers found, success at Vauxhall would become an almost immediate hit and could be transferred to the theatre and concert rooms, whereas a failure would hardly make a ripple. On many occasions, the music heard at Vauxhall had first been heard only weeks previously at Covent Garden Theatre, performed by the same musicians. As a summertime entertainment, running from May or June through to August or September, Vauxhall's season filled in that part of the year when the theatres were closed. It allowed London's top musicians to remain in the city throughout the year, rather than having to tour regional or foreign theatres to find work. Many of the most important figures in English music who composed at Vauxhall Gardens, such as Thomas Arne, William Boyce, John Lamb, Handel, John Hebden, John Stanley, and Thomas Gladwin, they had good reason to be grateful for Tyers for his generous and long-term patronage, as several were in-house composers. Jonathan Tyers subscribed to 4 sets of Handel's Concerto Grosso, which we will now have a listen to, and read the timeline of events from Pepys to the deaths of Handel, Hogarth, and Tyers. Vauxhall's orchestra most importantly comprised of the organ and also strings, trumpets, percussion, horn, oboes, bassoons, flutes, and other wind instruments, with most of the dozen or so musicians being able to play 2 or more different instruments. From 1735 onwards, the musicians at Vauxhall were some of the top professionals in London at the time, with Thomas Arne and the lead violinist Richard Collett, John Hebden, who we heard earlier, Charles Burney on viola and violin, and the trumpeter Valentine Snow. The music was performed by singers like Cecilia Arne, or Young before she married Thomas Arne, the tenor Thomas Lowe, and the bass Henry Theodore Reinhold, who all became celebrities in their own right while employed at Vauxhall, and also sung for Handel in the theatre. Tyers' musical evenings were structured to suit all tastes, with refined compositions such as overtures, organ and orchestral concertos, alternating with dance music, military airs, and popular pastoral, patriotic, and celebratory songs and group ballads. Tyers stipulated that his music should be specifically English music, composed and performed by English or at least English-based musicians. Handel, of course, was German-born and gained English nationality in 1727, and his music was generally accepted as English music, written in England for an English audience. In promoting contemporary English music, Tyers put a stamp on Vauxhall, making it different than the London theatres, where European, especially Italian music and performers held sway. The aria As Steals the Morn Upon the Night from Handel's L'Allegro il Penseroso e il Moderato has text by the great poet John Milton, summing up the ideals of balance at the Gardens. A statue at Vauxhall represented Milton as Il Penseroso, in an attitude listening to soft music. So perhaps close your eyes, imagine the feel of the wind in your hair, hearing the bird song, and you are transported to 18th century Vauxhall. almost all of the music of Vauxhall was newly composed, and much of it was pretty serious, which could have been quite difficult for an unsophisticated ear. The overriding concern in all Tyre's artistic decisions was balance between sophisticated and rustic, the lute of Apollo being countered by the pipes of Marsyas. Every member of Tyre's audience could find something to enjoy in the evening's mixed musical entertainments, and were free to listen or not, to choose their listening position, whether close to the orchestral bandstand or 100 meters away in the distant rural downs. The songs ranged from the lighter, more popular ones with engaging melodies and the themes of nature, nationalism, wit, the romantic or melancholic ballad, to the more complicated and operatically infused coloratura pieces. Vauxhall's concerts introduced a vast new audience to high quality music and staunchly defended English music and song. Song sheets were published and marketed to spread fame with texts by very famous poets such as John Lockeman. In 1745, Thomas Arne was appointed as music director at Vauxhall, which was a good job at the time for Catholics who could not find work in the churches. The Vauxhall song itself originated by Thomas Arne with the publication of his first book of Vauxhall songs called Lyric Harmony, and it is now recognised as a specific genre and kept English vocal music alive in this country for over a century through the Vauxhalls of the Morgan brothers, J.C. Bach, James Hook, Jonas Blewett, Henry Rowley Bishop, and John Sharp in the 1840s, leading directly into the music hall songs of Victorian times and to the works of Gilbert and Sullivan. I think one of the most popular events in the Garden's 200-year history was the final rehearsal for Handel's music for the Royal Fireworks at Vauxhall Gardens in 1749, attended by 6,000 or even 8,000 people, the largest audience for any musical event up to that time. The Gardens eventually closed in 1859 after much development and competition with other entertainments. To round off, it is of course impossible for a modern audience to put itself in the shoes of those visitors who listen to the music of Vauxhall. But it is clear that despite plenty of adverse criticism of the refreshments, of the waiters, and even of the painted decorations, there is no hint of criticism of any of the music at the time of Jonathan Tyers and of Handel. This is not because of any lack of musical taste or judgment among the public, because it is well known that musical tastes and opinions were very well developed at the time, nor is it out of deference to Handel. His music was widely criticized elsewhere. So we must assume that these musical performances and the composers, musicians, and singers all deserved the wonderful praise they received. I want to end with a short clip, as it comes as something of a shock to hear that one of the most popular pieces at Vauxhall throughout the mid-18th century was not a minuet or a hornpipe, but the solemn Dead March from Handel's oratorio Soul. This was played every year on the anniversary of the death of Jonathan Tyers, as well as at several state funerals. So there we have it, Handel at Vauxhall.
Good, thank you, Bridget. Lots of questions. Can I ask you the thing that occurs to me? How popular was Handel with his English contemporaries? Did they think they wanted to be in with this composer who's obviously better than they were, or were they jealous, or what? And how did that fit into the Vauxhall Gardens story?
Well, at Vauxhall they had in-house composers, so many composers worked there together, like Thomas Arne, Gladwin, Boyce. So I think they were used to playing together, and many of them played instruments for Handel as well in the orchestra at Vauxhall and elsewhere. So it was something that they got on with and did.
I mean, with my work on Vivaldi in Venice suggests that his contemporaries were much more of equal rank with him, as seen by all the other musicians, than we think. You know, we think Handel is several steps further up the ladder than Arne and Boyce and Green, and we think the same about Vivaldi. I think this is just the way that it seems to us today, isn't it? I mean, which is a justification for your work on this subject, really, I think.
Yes, it's interesting, and you know, I'm also very interested in the fact, you know, Handel worked in Italy, in Venice, earlier on in his career, and yet we have no evidence that he ever met Vivaldi, which seems strange.
It does. I think I think I did hear something about that. I've forgotten it now. But I mean, he was obviously wanting to get away from Germany, because Handel went to Italy because that was the place to be. That was the place to learn the craft, wasn't it? You know, if you were musicians today think, well, the way to get into this area of music is to go and study in Germany or Italy or whatever. You take these career decisions, and I'm sure it was especially true in Handel's day, in the early 18th century. You went to Italy because that was the place to be. And of course, we benefited in this country because Handel brought back the ideas of Italian singers with big, strong voices. I always make this point about the difference between the Handel opera and, for example, Dido and Aeneas. Dido and Aeneas was performed by probably smaller voices in a smaller space. Because the other thing that happened was this idea of bringing the concept of a big performance space, and probably open air music as well, although open air music was a thing in 17th century England.
And Vauxhall.
Yes, Vauxhall, absolutely. So how big were the Vauxhall Gardens?
Ooh,
I mean, if we stuck them on a modern map.
I would have to let you know. I can't think to hand, but it was very large, because there was parts of the downs were sort of miles. We're talking, and it was set out in different areas, as you can see. Sort of the middle, about the bandstand in the middle, and the various walkways. But over here, you've got the rural downs at the back as well.
Take that picture off the wall and hold it so we can see it.
Oh yes, this is. Can we see that? Was the light on it?
Glass. Yes, I see. Yeah. And the Handel statue is here somewhere, is it? Is that at the end of the
Yes, it's near the Grove in the middle, and you would arrive here. So the River Thames is down here.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Just if we can see a bit more.
Yes.
But it was very spread out as well, you know, with the downs and the fields surrounding.
Yeah. Very good. Don't drop it. So getting back to ranking the composers, who would you say was the next most important composer after Handel?
In London?
In this particular.
I'd say Thomas Arne. Thomas Arne. I mean, unfortunately, we've lost a lot of his music. He wrote, you know, over 100 operas, and there was I think most of them were burnt or have been destroyed.
Because Arne was a Catholic, wasn't he?
Yes.
He managed it. It's very strange. We think of Arne, the composer of Royal Britannia, Last Night at the Proms, English patriotism, patriotism, and the Union Jack, and all that stuff. But of course, he was a Catholic. Um, so was he a friend of Handel? Handel was quite a severe Protestant.
Well, they worked at Vauxhall. He performed at Vauxhall, but elsewhere too,
Yes.
amongst other composers.
And was Arne the person who introduced women into singing in oratorio choruses? Before that, it was boys, wasn't it?
At Vauxhall,
But
not at Vauxhall,
Arne was,
secular music.
Handel must have been quite used to using boys, as with the Messiah, as with Dublin.
Yeah.
Boys' voices, he wouldn't have used, of course, whereas Arne did.
Yes, and certainly, he at Vauxhall he introduced the song, as I said, the Vauxhall song,
Yes.
and men and women performed together, both solo and in groups.
Yes, yeah. Sorry, I see lots of people losing the will to live here. As I'm
Sorry, could I ask a question?
Yeah.
You painted a very exciting picture of the scene in London at the time, obviously in the Gardens, and I just wondered how that compared to other cultural centres around Europe, whether or not they had similar scenes or whether they were very different.
Yes, I think they were very different because Vauxhall Gardens really led the way. If you look at Tivoli Gardens and other places like this, I think Vauxhall was the leading light, and many others followed on afterwards.
So would performances in other cultural centres be in indoor spaces typically at the same time?
Well, typically in the theatre and the concert rooms, except if you were in a pleasure garden, because there was over 60 pleasure gardens in London at the time.
Wow.
There was a lot. So of course you would play outside then in the summer.
And that suggests that there was a lot of performers, musicians and singers, so that presumably made London an attractive place for people to come to
Yes, absolutely.
And become famous. Yeah.
Yes, very much so. Yes, it really was an attraction for performers to be there, to stay in London, the top professionals, to work here rather than travel abroad or to regional theatres.
Good, thank you.
Were these pavilions designed to focus the sound? Like the Hollywood Bowl, all this stuff. Were various techniques used to reflect the sound into the space?
Yes, if you could see, for example, the organ building. It's a square. Was a square structure.
I show it.
Semicircular, sort of semi-louvered windows, purely made to project the sound outwards, and therefore was economically a very good decision because it would save you having to book more musicians.
Is this the organ building, this one here?
Yes, at the back, the square, yes. And so there are windows at the top, and so the sound would be projected outwards, and there's
Right, so these are the musicians, and this is an organ, this thing.
Yeah, it's an organ, yes. And it was adjoining. There was a walkway between the two buildings.
Yeah, I see. Yes. Right. That's very interesting. I wouldn't have thought it lasted 5 minutes, that organ, actually, in that space, but never mind.
Was the emphasis on making music, or was the emphasis on commercial activity? Was it a great money-making machine, or it feels as though it was a really sort of exciting place with crowds of people paying lots of money to come and see musicians? Was that what it was about, or was it purely cultural, or a bit of both?
I think both, but it was a commercial triumph, yes, and that was due to Jonathan Tyers, who relaunched it and transformed it, so it really did become a commercial success as well as cultural.
So thinking about the situation, the dire situation we're in at the moment, for various reasons, mainly coronavirus and Brexit, can you draw any conclusions? Obviously, your work is quite important because you're drawing our attention to the tradition, aren't you? Do you? Coming back to John's question, if we don't have this kind of thing, if we don't have this kind of attitude to music, this kind of musical environment, do you think that's a very bad thing for the future of music?
Do you mean playing outside, or?
Well, and the whole idea of a sort of musical culture that works this way.
Well, I suppose today I mentioned Glastonbury, you know, an outdoor festival with different groups and different artists playing for a mass audience. It is important. Obviously, it's something we can't maybe achieve right now, but
No.
hopefully we'll again.
And how many people would have been in these pictures we've seen? So, what does that represent? How many hundred people are we talking about?
Oh, I'd say 1,000. I mean, it was huge. I mean, as I mentioned, for the music at the Royal Fireworks for the rehearsal, it said it was attended by between 6,000 to even 8,000 people.
Yeah.
So it really was very, very attractive.
So that's more than the number you could cram into the Albert Hall, really.
Mm.
Yes.
Yes, it was the first mass, mass performance outside.
Were the people selling food? Were the people walking around with trays of?
Yes, and waiters, and as I mentioned at the end, there was criticism of the food, there was criticism of the waiters, of the decorations, but not of the music.
Right. Good. The girls all said they were going to ask you some questions. They were all so keen to jump in because they talk so much.
Try my best.
I put them all big. So let's have some questions from our musicians here. Annika, what are you going to say? Say something.
Do you think that a sense of nationalism could have contributed to the popularity, given that it was kind of only English music that was being played? Or not really an element that would have contributed?
Yes, you're absolutely right. Nationalism, patriotism, yes. Lots of the songs were patriotic, maybe based off the Battle of Culloden or different events. It was very contemporary, very topical, what was happening right now, the popular music of the day. And yes, that was very much a large aspect, because in the theatres, it was dominated by Italian music. So
was there a preference for English music in England, or do you think that the tastes were kind of more eclectic at the time?
I think in the theatres, it was very much pro-Italy. European music was still the fashion before the development of oratorio. Like I say, at the Gardens, really because the owner wanted to put his mark, he wanted to put his stamp on Vauxhall and say, we're different, we are promoting English music.
Was that at all politically driven? Was it a government sort of to try and increase the sort of a bit of jingoism to nationalism? Was there any element of that? I can't quite place it politically, but
I don't know. I think it was mainly commercially driven, okay, and culturally. But certainly Prince Frederick of Wales was a regular attendee. And he was hugely popular, so there was that huge political following there too.
Just give us some dates, Bridget, of the music examples we've had.
Sorry, Richard, I missed that.
The dates, please.
The dates. Let's have a think. So the hornpipe was composed in 1740 for Vauxhall. We've got there at Comus. As Steele's the Morn. So basically, we're looking at the music of around the 1745, most of it.
This is Handel's era, isn't it?
It's Handel. It's when Thomas Arne became the director of music in 1745, and things became a little bit more established there. So yes, I said mid 18th century.
So we had Italian opera, and then we had the sort of Protestant clamp down after that, and the development of oratorio. Is this the next stage on from that, really? Because I feel that with George the Second, things got a bit sort of slightly repressive artistically, didn't they? Or did you agree?
Well, I think from I said that the Vauxhalls, from the music itself, it definitely did set the scene and continue music making with J.C. Bach, Hook, up to Gilbert and Sullivan. So it really did promote that and continue English music making and vocal music particularly.
Oh. And European opera was less a thing, wasn't it? In in England. Really.
Passions were changing.
Yes.
Yes, they began to change. Yes.
Because nothing much moved on that front until Haydn came to London in the 1790s.
Yes, later 18th century.
Yeah. Good. This is interesting stuff. Yeah. Other
I
questions?
just want to inspire some of your wonderful singers to look more at the English repertoire, and I'm sure lots of you play instruments as well, as did lots of the band. They performed on different instruments, so it was just to inspire people to maybe look at some of this English music, because sometimes people say to me, oh, but there was no English music between Purcell and Elgar. What was happening? And if you look into it, there was a lot going on.
Yeah, well, my answer would be there was Handel, and he was an Englishman.
Yes.
Because Germans really, they use the umlaut and they pretend that he didn't spend any time in England at all.
Yeah.
Remained a German throughout his life. I mean, it is a bit of a problem. I've looked at boys' songs with singers, and I always try so hard to think this is a beautiful melody. It's every bit as good as Handel, but the fact is, it isn't.
William Boyce. Yes, Handel's music is phenomenal. It really is extraordinary.
I do think that Arne is a very important composer. I mean, Arne has a certain quality to him that's quite gripping, really. I think
yes.
Arne tunes are great melodies, and he looks like someone who was a good composer in a slightly different style from Handel, whereas Boyce looks a bit like a pale imitation. And I'm afraid Maurice Greene, I do think, is an even paler imitation.
Then if you look at the instrumental music and the organ music, a lot of these composers wrote some wonderful stuff.
I like Stanley. John Stanley.
Stanley, yes. Stanley, Morgan, some wonderful music.
Yeah. And of course, there was a feat to come back to John's point. I think it was probably less political, more cultural. There was the idea that Britain was becoming an even more important and powerful and invincible power was what drove it. And I think that the Protestant ethic, or the Protestant work ethic, was what was behind this, I feel. And this was and this musical culture was, whilst it did have parallels with the continent, it was an English thing, and I think you were a hedge fund trader in the day, and you went to Vauxhall Gardens at the weekend, really. Slightly. Well, if we keep going another 5 minutes, if you don't ask some more questions, I will. What do we know about the buildings in Vauxhall? Who designed them and who funded them, and how did that work?
Yes, as I mentioned, they were funded largely funded by the new owner, Jonathan Tyers, who was the greatest patron of the arts in the 18th century that most people have never heard of. He created some innovative installations like the orchestra and the organ building. It was probably the first building designed for music, solely for music outdoors. And there was many pavilions in the Chinese style, different themes of the garden. You go into different areas, statues, sculptures. The Handel Robiliac is incredible, just wonderful. Do go and see it if you haven't, at the Victorian Albert Museum. Really quite impressive.
There were buildings that you didn't listen out of doors, but there were pavilion type buildings you went inside to listen to. Like there's a novel called Music and Silence by Rose Tremaine, which is about the court of Christian IV of Denmark and Dowland, and he was a very repressive employer. And this was a two-tier building. He had a dining room on the second floor, and on the ground floor was the music room, and it was lit. It was dark, and it was lit by candles, and there were these sort of vents which linked the music room underneath to the dining room upstairs. And when the king got fed up with the music, he would slam the vents shut, which would extinguish the candles in the room below, and the music would stop. It was a really nasty piece of work, was Christian IV. And so that was a tradition, but that was a specially built building. And there are other buildings too. I think Thomas Mace, we're talking about the early 17th century now, had a music building which worked on similar basis. So architects were experimenting with this challenge, really.
Yes, and say artists as well, like Hogarth,
Yes.
Francis Hayman. They were decorating the supper boxes. Everyone came together, pulled together to create this wonderful place.
So a supper box. This is a sort of cafeteria, is it? What is it?
It was a shelter,
Yeah.
where you would dine, and lots of artists painted them inside, and they would be covered by a sort of by a shield. So they would be revealed during dinner. So that was a conversation piece. Suddenly you would see this great painting with perhaps a naval or a pastoral scene, painted by contemporary artists.
Like people exhibit in restaurants today, that sort of thing.
Yes.
So how long did this go on for? When did this tradition end?
Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens, 1859, really, with the development of the train stations and entertainments changed.
Yeah.
Obviously, Vauxhall changed as well, though. It became sort of a wonderful place with different entertainments, with hot air balloon rides and tightrope walkers and all kinds. But in 1859, it finally closed because fashions changed. People could take the train and go to the beach. Different times for different things.
Yeah. Good. Well, I've run out of questions. Any other questions? John.
If not, I can show you this. This is the wonderful book by David Cook, David E. Cook and Alan Borg,
Yeah.
which took 40 years to compile. Yes, it's absolutely incredible, with lots of beautiful pictures, musical examples. And David Cook's father, Gerald Cook, donated the Handel manuscripts to the Foundling Museum, which are wonderful. Go and see them if you can.